In Houston's Lakewood Church, a quietly observant retiree slipped into the third row as thousands prepared for Pastor Joel Osteen's Sunday broadcast. What began as another glittering service in America's largest megachurch turned deadly serious when an unexpected figure walked the aisle. Chuck Norris himself, moving with purpose toward the pulpit as security froze mid-step. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical churchgoer. For decades, he had been a U.S. Air Force veteran, six-time world karate champion, and martial arts instructor to elite operatives, known worldwide as the man who never flinched. But faith, not fame, had always been his truest battleground. When Lakewood's security team prepared to intercept, they had no idea they were about to face not a threat, but a reckoning. Norris took the stage and delivered a spiritual strike that shattered the polished veneer of prosperity, preaching and forced a megachurch empire to confront its own soul. What began as a sermon of success became a confrontation of faith. And when the dust settled, America's largest megachurch stood forever changed, its smiling certainty replaced by the fierce clarity of conviction, all because Chuck Norris refused to let truth wait another Sunday. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The air inside Lakewood Church hummed with anticipation. 20,000 souls packed into what was once Houston's Compact Center, now transformed into America's largest megachurch. A cathedral of modern faith, wrapped in sleek architecture and bathed in theatrical lighting. On massive screens above the stage, inspirational quotes cycled through in elegant typography, backed by soft piano music that swelled through hidden speakers. In the media pit, Evelyn Carter adjusted her camera settings, capturing B-roll for her feature on Faith in the Modern Age. Her editor had pitched it as an exploration of religion's evolution, but they both knew the real draw. Joel Osteen himself, America's smiling pastor, whose broadcasts reached millions. Evelyn remained skeptical. Religion had never been her thing, but she couldn't deny Osteen's cultural impact. 2 minutes to broadcast, announced a production assistant, his voice crackling through headsets worn by the camera crew. The energy in the room shifted as attendees straightened in their seats, raised phones to capture the moment. Parents quieted children. In the front row, Victoria Osteen smoothed her dress and smiled at several church elders. Behind her, a section reserved for VIPs held a mixture of local politicians, business leaders, and celebrities who found Lakewood's positive message appealing. The section wasn't full. Sunday morning in Houston meant some regulars were away, which explained why no one noticed when a casually dressed older man slipped into an empty seat at the end of the third row. Marcus Reyes, head of Lakewood's security team, scanned the crowd from his position near the main entrance. 6 years as a Marine and 4 working executive protection had honed his instincts. But today felt routine. His earpiece buzzed with standard check-ins from his team. "All sectors clear," came the report. Ready for Pastor Joel. The house lights dimmed. The congregation rose in unified anticipation. The choir, arranged in ascending tiers behind the stage, began to sing a modern worship anthem with driving percussion and soaring vocals. Spotlights swirled across the stage, and the energy built until, perfectly timed to the musical crescendo, Joel Osteen bounded onto the stage. "Good morning, Lakewood." His voice was warm, enthusiastic, instantly recognizable. The response was immediate and electric applause, cheers, some raising hands in worship. Joel moved across the stage with practiced ease, his smile radiant under the lights. He wore a tailored blue suit, no tie, his hair perfectly styled. Everything about him projected success, confidence, and approachability. "It's so good to see each and every one of you today. What a beautiful Sunday God has given us." Joel's voice carried through the state-of-the-art sound system, wrapping the congregation in its warmth. "I want to welcome those joining us from around the world. You are part of our extended family, and we're so honored you've chosen to spend this morning with us." Evelyn zoomed in, catching the practiced sincerity in his expression. She had to admit the man was good at what he did. There was something undeniably compelling about his presence. "Today, I want to talk about unlocking the blessings God has for your life," Joel continued, his voice rising with conviction. "Too many people are living beneath their privileges. God didn't create you to barely get by. He created you to thrive." The congregation responded with enthusiastic amens. Joel moved to center stage, where a clear plexiglass podium held his notes and a leather-bound Bible. "Say this with me. Something good is going to happen to me today." The crowd repeated the phrase in unison, energy building. Again, "Something good is going to happen to me today." Louder this time, thousands of voices merged into one hopeful declaration. Joel nodded approvingly, his smile widening. That's not just positive thinking, that's faith speaking. That's you aligning with heaven's perspective on your life. As Joel launched into his sermon, Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A man rising from the third row, moving with deliberate calm toward the center aisle. Something about his posture caught Marcus's attention. He wasn't moving like the occasional enthusiastic worshiper who might approach the stage. His walk was measured, purposeful. Marcus tapped his earpiece. Movement from third row. Center section. Male. Late 70 seconds. Moving toward main aisle. He shifted position for a better angle and froze. The man's profile was unmistakable, the strong jawline, the focused gaze, the ramrod-straight posture that age hadn't diminished. "Holy shit," Marcus whispered, forgetting protocol. "That's Chuck Norris." The legendary martial artist and actor moved steadily forward, his expression unreadable. He wore no disguise, just jeans, boots, and a simple button-down shirt under a suede jacket. But something in his demeanor had rendered him nearly invisible until now, a quietness that stood in stark contrast to the spectacle unfolding on stage. On stage, Joel was building momentum. God doesn't see your mistakes. When he looks at you, he sees potential. He sees the champion he created you to be. The congregation clapped, but a ripple of murmurs began spreading from the center section. Heads turned. Phones shifted from filming Joel to capturing Chuck's steady progress down the aisle. Joel, sensing the attention shift but unable to see its cause from the bright stage, continued with practiced smoothness. "The door to your blessed future isn't locked by your past. It's unlocked by your faith." Chuck reached the front of the church now, just steps from the stage. A junior security team member moved to intercept him, but Marcus held up his hand, signaling him to wait. There was no aggression in Chuck's body language, only purpose. Joel's gaze finally found the source of distraction, and for a split second, his practiced composure faltered. The Bible says. The Bible tells us that faith is the substance of things hoped for. By now, the disruption was impossible to ignore. Whispers raced through the congregation. "Is that Chuck Norris? What's he doing here? Is this part of the program?" Victoria Osteen stood from her front row seat, concern evident on her face. The choir director glanced nervously at his singers, who continued their soft background music, but with eyes now fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Chuck reached the steps leading to the stage. Two security personnel moved forward uncertainly, looking to Marcus for direction. But Chuck simply raised his hand, not in threat, but in a gesture of peace, and something in his quiet authority made them pause. Joel, ever the professional, attempted to incorporate the interruption. "Well, it looks like we have a special guest with us today." His voice carried a hint of uncertainty beneath the warmth. Chuck climbed the steps, his eyes never leaving Joel's. The contrast between them was striking. Joel in his tailored suit and camera-ready smile. Chuck, in his simple attire, weathered face solemn. Evelyn swung her camera to capture this unexpected development, pulse quickening with journalistic instinct. This was no longer a routine story on modern faith. This was something else entirely. The music faded to silence. 20,000 people held their breath. Chuck stopped several feet from Joel, giving him space. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly across the hushed sanctuary. "Pastor Osteen," he said with a slight nod of respect, "I apologize for the interruption, but I've been listening to your words, and I believe God has sent me here with a different message, one that can't wait." Joel's smile remained fixed, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes. In all his years of ministry, through hecklers and critics and unexpected technical difficulties, he had never faced a moment quite like this. "I'm here," Chuck continued, his voice gaining strength, "because what's happening in this church, in many churches across America, has been weighing on my heart, and sometimes truth needs to interrupt comfort." The congregation sat in stunned silence. Marcus touched his earpiece, but issued no commands. Something told him this was not a security threat, but something far more profound. In the media pit, Evelyn's finger hovered over the broadcast button on her camera, knowing instinctively that what was about to unfold might be the most important moment she would ever capture. Joel Osteen, with cameras rolling and the world watching, took a deep breath and made a choice that would change everything. "Then I believe we should listen," he said, surprising everyone, perhaps even himself. "What message has God placed on your heart, Mr. Norris?" The silence deepened as Chuck stood before the congregation, his presence commanding the massive space without effort. The theatrical lights that had been programmed for Joel's sermon now cast long shadows across Chuck's weathered face, highlighting eyes that had seen decades of both Hollywood fame and private spiritual wrestling. Joel stepped back slightly, a microphone still in hand. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his services, the surrender of his stage represented an unprecedented moment of vulnerability. In the front row, Victoria's expression shifted from concern to curious attention. Beside her, several church elders exchanged worried glances, while others seemed oddly relieved, as if a long-held breath was finally being released. Chuck approached the podium with unhurried steps. When he reached for the microphone, Joel extended. The exchange was neither aggressive nor theatrical, just the passing of a simple tool from one man to another. Their hands briefly connected, and something unspoken passed between them. "I didn't come here to condemn," Chuck began, his voice carrying the slight Texas drawl of his upbringing. "I came because I love the church, the real church, too much to stay silent." He surveyed the vast congregation, making eye contact with those in the front rows. Some shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned forward in anticipation. "For those who don't know me beyond the movies, I've been a believer for over 50 years. I've had fame, success, wealth, all the things many prosperity messages promise." Chuck paused, his gaze returning to Joel. "But the Jesus I know never promised comfort. He promised purpose. He promised truth. And sometimes, truth is the most uncomfortable thing we can hear." Murmurs rippled through the congregation. In the production booth, directors frantically debated whether to cut the live stream. The decision was made to continue. Millions were watching, and interrupting now would only amplify whatever was unfolding. Marcus Reyes had moved closer to the stage, positioned where he could intervene if necessary. But as he listened to Chuck's words, his hand dropped from his earpiece. This wasn't a threat to be neutralized. It was a moment to be witnessed. "Pastor Osteen," Chuck continued, addressing Joel directly but speaking loud enough for all to hear, "you have been blessed with a platform few ministers in history have ever known. Your words reach millions, Your smile brings comfort. Your optimism lifts spirits." Joel nodded cautiously, unsure where this was heading. "But I've been watching and listening to your messages for years, and I've been asking myself, where is the cross in this gospel? Where is the call to die to self? Where is the Jesus who said it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven?" The words landed like stones in still water, ripples of discomfort spreading through the congregation. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted defensively in their seats. "The faith that changed my life wasn't one that promised bigger houses or better jobs," Chuck said, his voice unwavering. "It was one that promised that even in my darkest moments, God would be present. It was one that gave me the courage to stand for what's right when standing alone meant ridicule or rejection." He turned slightly, addressing the congregation directly now. "How many of you came here today expecting to be comforted? To be told that God wants you to be prosperous? That your best life is now? That faith is the key to unlocking material blessings?" Hands tentatively raised throughout the sanctuary. "And how many of you are hurting deeply, facing terminal illness, broken marriages, children lost to addiction, financial ruin, and wondering why your faith hasn't fixed those problems?" Fewer hands, raised more slowly, but with a rawness that cut through the polished atmosphere of the service. Chuck nodded solemnly. "The most dangerous lie in modern Christianity isn't found in atheism or secular culture. It's found in pulpits that have replaced the Jesus of Gethsemane, who sweat blood, asking for the cup to pass from him, but submitted anyway, with a cosmic vending machine who exists to grant our wishes if our faith is strong enough." In the media pit, Evelyn had stopped taking notes, her recorder capturing everything as she watched, transfixed. Raised without religion, she had approached this assignment with professional detachment. But something about the authenticity of this moment, the collision of celebrity, faith, and raw truth, was piercing her journalistic armor. Joel stood nearby, listening. His expression was complex discomfort, mingled with what appeared to be genuine reflection. This was not how he had planned his Sunday message, but something kept him from reclaiming the stage. "I've made movies where the good guys always win, where justice always prevails, where the hero walks away with barely a scratch," Chuck continued. "But that's Hollywood. Real faith, the kind that sustains you when your wife is diagnosed with cancer, when your child rejects everything you've taught them, when your body fails you, that faith isn't about winning. It's about surrendering." He looked directly at Joel again. "Pastor, I believe you love God. I believe you want to help people. But the message of prosperity without purpose, blessing without brokenness, and faith without sacrifice isn't the gospel. It's spiritual fast food. It tastes good going down, but it cannot sustain." Victoria Osteen had risen from her seat and now stood at the edge of the stage, her presence a silent support for her husband in this unexpected moment. Her expression was not defensive but attentive. Chuck noticed her and acknowledged her with a respectful nod. The strength of a ministry isn't measured by the size of its building or the reach of its broadcast. It's measured by its willingness to speak truth even when truth isn't marketable. Joel finally stepped forward, accepting a second microphone from an assistant. The congregation held its collective breath, social media feeds exploding as millions watched what would happen next. "Mr. Norris," Joel began, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I appreciate your passion and your concern, and I want to hear more. But may I respond briefly?" Chuck nodded, extending the same respect he'd been shown. "For years, I've heard criticism that my message focuses too much on blessing and not enough on suffering," Joel said. "And perhaps some of that is fair. But I've sat with the broken. I've prayed with the dying. I've seen how many people come to church already beaten down by life, already told they're not enough." His voice grew stronger, as he continued. My father taught me that the world will remind you 1,000 times what you can't do, what you've done wrong, why you don't deserve God's love. He believed, and I believe, that the church should be the one place that reminds you that God sees beyond your failures. Chuck listened intently, his expression revealing neither agreement nor disagreement. But, Joel added, and the single word seemed to cost him something, if in trying to lift people up, I've created an incomplete picture of faith, one that promises mountaintop experiences without valleys, then that's something I need to reflect on. A murmur of surprise passed through the congregation. In all his years of ministry, through controversies and criticisms, Joel Osteen had rarely conceded any ground publicly. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus, still watching from the side, felt something shift in the atmosphere, tension giving way to something more sacred, more authentic than anything he'd witnessed in his years of service at Lakewood. Perhaps, Joel said, glancing around at the thousands of faces turned toward him. We all need to be reminded that real faith isn't measured by how much God changes our circumstances, but by how much He changes us through our circumstances. It was as if the air itself had changed in the vast sanctuary. What had begun as an interruption, a potential confrontation, was transforming into something else entirely. A moment of unexpected authenticity, playing out before thousands in person and millions online. Chuck's weathered face softened slightly. That's all I'm asking for, Pastor. Not that you stop encouraging people. God knows we need hope, but that the hope you offer is anchored in something deeper than material blessing or positive thinking. He turned to face the congregation fully now. I've been blessed with a long life. I've known fame that few experience. But the most powerful moments of my faith didn't come when God said yes to my prayers. They came when He said no, and then showed me why His plan was better than mine. As Chuck spoke, a single figure rose from the back of the sanctuary and began walking down the aisle. Pastor Daniel Brooks, Lakewood's associate minister, who had served quietly for decades, first under Joel's father and now under Joel. His steps were slow but deliberate, his aged face lined with emotion. All eyes turned as he approached the stage, his traditional clerical collar a contrast to Joel's more contemporary style. I believe, Daniel said, his voice carrying without a microphone, that God is doing something sacred in this house today. He climbed the steps with effort, assisted by Marcus, who had moved forward instinctively. When Daniel reached the center of the stage, he looked from Chuck to Joel, then out to the congregation. For years, he said, his voice quavering with emotion, I've served this church and loved its people. I've seen it grow from a small congregation to this. He gestured at the massive space around them. And in that growth, I've sometimes wondered if we've lost something precious along the way. Joel looked at his longtime associate with surprise. Daniel had always been loyal, supportive, rarely offering public dissent. The gospel, the real gospel, will draw people in, but it will also drive some away, Daniel continued. Jesus Himself said the path is narrow, and few find it. I've worried that in our desire to fill these seats, we've widened the path so much that it no longer leads where it should. In the silence that followed, a surprising sound emerged. Victoria Osteen's voice, clear and emotional. Joel, she said, stepping onto the stage to stand beside her husband. I think we should listen. Really listen. The four figures now stood in a loose circle at the center of the vast stage. Joel and Victoria Osteen, Chuck Norris, and Pastor Daniel. Around them, 20,000 people witnessed something few megachurch services ever offered, a moment of genuine, unscripted vulnerability. Evelyn Carter, still filming from the media pit, felt a lump forming in her throat. Whatever story she had come to cover had transformed into something far more profound. This wasn't just about religion or celebrity or spectacle anymore. This was about the universal human hunger for authenticity and the courage it takes to pursue it, even when the whole world is watching. Joel Osteen took a deep breath, looked out at his congregation, then back to Chuck. His next words would reveal whether this interruption would become merely an interesting footnote in Lakewood's history or the beginning of something transformative. "Mr. Norris," he said, his voice carrying a new humility, "would you share with us what a gospel of both grace and truth looks like in your experience? I think we all need to hear it." And with that invitation, the real sermon began. Chuck took a moment to collect his thoughts, the weight of the invitation settling on him. 20,000 people waited in reverent silence. The polished production of Lakewood's typical Sunday service had given way to something raw and unplanned. Cameras still rolled. Lights still shone. But the carefully orchestrated program had surrendered to a moment of authentic searching. "I'm not a preacher," Chuck began, his voice carrying a humble strength that filled the sanctuary. "I'm just a man who's walked with God through light and darkness, success and failure. And if there's anything I've learned, it's that God is less concerned with our comfort than our character." He paced slowly, his boots echoing on the stage. "When I was younger, I built my life around being the toughest guy in the room. 6 world karate championships, Hollywood calling, my face on posters and magazine covers." Chuck shook his head slightly. "I had everything the world says should make you happy, and I was empty." Joel listened intently, standing beside Victoria and Daniel. The 4 of them created an unexpected picture: the polished televangelist, his supportive wife, the aged traditional pastor, and the weathered action star united in a moment of unexpected vulnerability. "Then I met a man named Carlos," Chuck continued. "A chaplain on a movie set who didn't care about my fame or my kicks. He cared about my soul. He didn't tell me Jesus would make me more successful. He told me Jesus would make me more human." The congregation leaned in, social media temporarily forgotten as the power of story captivated them. "I accepted Christ in my 30s, but it took decades to understand that following him isn't about getting what you want. It's about becoming who you were created to be." Chuck's voice grew stronger. "And sometimes that transformation hurts. Sometimes it costs you everything." He turned to face Joel directly. "Pastor Osteen, you've built a ministry that makes people feel good. And there's value in hope. Real, genuine hope. But hope without truth is just wishful thinking." Joel nodded slowly, his usual smile replaced by thoughtful attention. "The Bible I read," Chuck continued, addressing the congregation again, "tells the story of a God who doesn't remove suffering, but redeems it, of disciples who didn't gain wealth but gained purpose, of a Savior who promised that in this world we would have trouble, but that he had overcome the world." Marcus Reyes, still positioned near the stage, found himself nodding in agreement. As a Marine, he had seen the worst of humanity in combat zones. The platitudes of prosperity gospel had never matched his experience, but he'd remained at Lakewood out of loyalty to the community. Now, hearing Chuck articulate the disconnect he'd felt for years, something inside him resonated deeply. "I remember filming a scene once," Chuck said, his tone shifting to storytelling, "where my character was supposed to show no pain while taking a beating. The director kept saying, 'Less reaction, Chuck, you're indestructible.' And I thought, what a terrible message. What human being is indestructible? What person doesn't feel pain?" He gestured to the vast space around them. "Sometimes I think we've created a Christianity that's like that movie scene where showing weakness is forbidden, where admitting struggle means your faith isn't strong enough, where preachers themselves can't acknowledge their own dark nights of the soul. In the media pit, Evelyn scribbled notes frantically, capturing every word. Despite her secular background, something about the authenticity of this moment transcended religious boundaries. This wasn't about theology anymore, it was about truth-telling in an age of performance. Chuck's gaze swept across the congregation. How many of you have ever felt like your struggles mean God has abandoned you? How many have been afraid to admit depression, doubt, or failure because it might suggest your faith is weak? Hands rose tentatively throughout the sanctuary. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. Among them was Victoria Osteen's, raised with quiet courage. The gospel, the real gospel, isn't that Jesus takes away our pain, Chuck continued. It's that he enters into it with us. It's not that faith shields you from suffering, it's that faith gives meaning to suffering. He turned back to Joel. Pastor, you have an opportunity that few will ever have to speak truth to millions. Not just the easy truths that fill seats, but the hard truths that transform lives. Joel stepped forward, emotion visible on his face. Mr. Norris, I hear you. And there's wisdom in your words. But may I ask, what would you have me do? Tell people God wants them to suffer? That their prayers won't be answered? It was a genuine question, not a defensive retort. Around the sanctuary, many nodded, equally curious about the answer. Chuck shook his head. No. Keep telling them God loves them because He does. Keep telling them God has good plans for them because He does. But help them understand that God's definition of good might look different than theirs. He moved closer to Joel, his voice softening, but still carrying through the microphone. Tell them about the day your father died, and how faith sustained you not by taking away the pain, but by giving you strength to endure it. Tell them about the criticism you've faced, and how God taught you humility through it. Tell them your own struggles, your own doubts. Joel's expression revealed surprise, as if Chuck had somehow seen into private chapters of his life. In other words, Chuck concluded, show them not just the resurrection on Sunday, but the crucifixion on Friday. Because without the cross, the empty tomb loses its power. Pastor Daniel Brooks stepped forward, his aged voice surprisingly strong. He's right, Joel. I've watched you grow from a cameraman behind your father's pulpit to a voice that reaches around the world. Your gift is real. Your heart is good. But every gift needs balance, and every heart needs challenge. Victoria gently took Joel's hand, a gesture of support that spoke volumes. This wasn't humiliation or condemnation, it was an invitation to greater depth. In the back of the sanctuary, something unexpected began to happen. People were standing not in protest, not to leave, but in a spontaneous gesture of respect and recognition. The movement spread from section to section, a quiet affirmation that truth was being spoken and heard. Joel looked out at his congregation, visibly moved by their response. Then he turned back to Chuck. You didn't come here to tear down, did you? He asked quietly. You came because you care about the message reaching its full potential. Chuck nodded. The world doesn't need another celebrity, Pastor Osteen. It doesn't need another motivational speaker. It needs shepherds who will speak both comfort and challenge, who will lead to both green pastures and through dark valleys. For a moment, Joel closed his eyes, seeming to wrestle internally with everything being said. When he opened them, there was a new clarity in his gaze. You're right, he said simply, his voice carrying through the sanctuary. And I think it's time I lead with more courage. He turned to face his congregation fully, no longer the polished presenter, but a man standing in a moment of genuine transformation. For years, Joel began, I've told you that God wants you to prosper, to live victoriously. and I still believe that's true. But today, I need to tell you the rest of the truth that prosperity isn't measured in dollars, and victory often comes through surrender. A wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. Surprise, confusion, but also a growing sense of respect. My father built this ministry on faith that God is good, even when life isn't. Joel continued, his voice growing stronger. Somewhere along the way, I think I started focusing more on the blessings than the one who blesses more on the gifts than the giver. Victoria squeezed his hand, tears in her eyes. Starting today, Joel said, his gaze sweeping across the thousands of faces turned toward him. I make you this promise. I will tell you the whole truth, not just the parts that fill seats or sell books. I will share not just mountaintop experiences but valley journeys. I will speak of a God who doesn't just change your circumstances but changes you through your circumstances. Throughout the sanctuary, people began to rise to their feet, not in the choreographed enthusiasm of a typical service, but in spontaneous recognition of an authentic moment. Even those who had come as skeptics, like Evelyn, found themselves standing in respect for the courage they were witnessing. Chuck stepped back, content to let Joel reclaim his pulpit not as it had been, but as it could be. His mission hadn't been to humiliate or replace, but to awaken. Marcus watched from the sidelines, deeply moved. In his earpiece, security team members were asking if they should intervene, but he silenced them with a simple, "Stand down. This is supposed to happen." Joel turned to Chuck, genuine gratitude in his expression. "Would you pray with us, Mr. Norris? Not a performance prayer, but a real one. The kind that acknowledges both our hopes and our fears?" Chuck nodded, stepping forward again. The two men stood side by side, no longer as challenger and challenged, but as brothers in a shared faith. "Let's pray," Chuck said, his voice quiet, but carrying through the silent sanctuary. 20,000 heads bowed. Cameras continued to roll, capturing a moment unlike any in Lakewood's history, perhaps unlike any in the history of the modern megachurch. "Father," Chuck began, his weathered voice carrying decades of both struggle and faith, "we come to you, not as the audience expects, not as the world approves, but as we truly are broken, limited, and desperately in need of your grace." The prayer continued, raw and unscripted, acknowledging human frailty and divine strength. As Chuck spoke, something shifted in the atmosphere, performance giving way to presence, spectacle surrendering to sincerity. When the prayer ended, Joel remained with head bowed for a long moment. When he finally looked up, the transformation that had begun with an interruption seemed complete. There were tears in his eyes, but also a clarity that hadn't been there before. "Thank you," he said simply to Chuck, then turned to address his congregation. "The service today will continue, but not as planned. I think it's time we talked honestly about what faith really costs and what it's really worth." As Joel began to speak with newfound depth and courage, Chuck quietly stepped back. His mission complete. He made his way to the side of the stage where Marcus stood. "You could have stopped me," Chuck said quietly. Marcus shook his head. "Some interruptions are meant to happen, sir." In the media pit, Evelyn Carter put down her camera, knowing she had captured something historic not just for Lakewood Church, but for anyone seeking authenticity in an age of carefully curated images. Her cynicism hadn't disappeared, but it had been challenged by witnessing genuine transformation. As Chuck slipped away from the spotlight, making his exit as quietly as he had entered, the true impact of his intervention was just beginning to unfold, not in shouts or spectacle, but in the sacred silence of hearts being changed, one truth at a time. The following hour unfolded like nothing Lakewood had ever experienced. Joel Osteen, freed from his prepared notes and polished presentation, spoke with a vulnerability that transformed the massive sanctuary into an intimate gathering. The programmed lighting sequence had been abandoned, house lights raised so speaker and congregation could truly see each other. For years, Joel confessed, his voice carrying a new weight, "I've been afraid to preach certain passages, afraid they might drive people away, afraid they might undermine the message of hope I felt called to share." He held up his Bible, the leather worn from use. But this book doesn't give us the luxury of selective reading. The God who promises to bless us is the same God who calls us to carry our cross. Throughout the sanctuary, the atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to reverence. Phones had largely been put away, social media updates forgotten, as something more authentic commanded attention. Victoria had taken a seat in the front row. Her expression, a mixture of pride and solemn reflection. Beside her, Pastor Daniel nodded encouragement as Joel navigated this uncharted territory. In the media section, Evelyn watched, transfixed. Her cynical journalist's eye had been trained to spot manipulation, to see through performance. But what she witnessed now carried the unmistakable ring of authenticity, a public figure risking his carefully constructed image for something more valuable. "I want to tell you about my darkest moment," Joel said, settling onto a stool that an assistant had brought to center stage. The casual posture itself was a departure from his typical dynamic presentation. Not because it makes for a good story, but because it might help you understand that faith isn't about avoiding valleys, it's about finding God in them. He spoke of his father's sudden death in 1999, just days before Joel was scheduled to preach his first sermon. He described the crushing grief, the panic attacks that few knew about, the crisis of confidence that nearly derailed his ministry before it began. The prosperity gospel has no good explanation for moments like that, Joel admitted. If positive thinking and strong faith are all it takes to receive blessing, then what does it mean when tragedy strikes anyway? Does it mean your faith wasn't strong enough? That God failed you? That the promises aren't real? Throughout the congregation, people leaned forward, captivated by questions that many had wrestled with privately but rarely heard addressed from the pulpit. "The truth I've been afraid to emphasize," Joel continued, "is that God's greatest work often happens not despite our suffering but through it. Not by removing obstacles but by transforming us as we face them." From the back of the sanctuary, a man's voice called out not in anger but in desperate need. "Then where was God when my daughter died of cancer? Where was the blessing in that?" In a typical Lakewood service, such an interruption would have been quickly managed by ushers. But Joel raised his hand, signaling that the question deserved acknowledgement. "I don't know," he answered honestly, his amplified voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "And I've been afraid to say those 3 words for a long time. I've been afraid that admitting the limits of my understanding might undermine your faith. But real faith doesn't require perfect answers. It persists even in the face of unanswerable questions." The man who had called out remained standing, tears visible even from a distance. "What I can tell you," Joel continued, addressing him directly, "is that God was present in your pain, even if you couldn't feel him, that your daughter's worth isn't measured by the length of her life, but by the love that defined it, and that the gospel promises not that we won't suffer, but that our suffering will never be meaningless." The raw honesty of the exchange created a ripple effect through the congregation. Here and there, people began to stand, not in protest, but in solidarity, in recognition of shared human experience. Marcus Reyes, still at his post near the stage, found himself unexpectedly moved. He had served at Lakewood out of respect for the community, even while privately questioning aspects of its message. Now, witnessing a moment of genuine transformation, he felt the first stirrings of something he'd almost forgotten: hope, that faith could be both authentic and powerful. Victoria made her way to the stage, joining her husband in this unexpected moment of ministry. Her presence wasn't scripted or announced, but it carried a silent power, the support of a partner willing to walk through both triumph and transformation. "I think," Joel said, looking at her with genuine gratitude, "that it's time we create space for real questions, real doubts, real pain. The church should be the one place where we don't have to pretend." He turned back to the congregation, a new conviction in his voice. "Chuck Norris didn't come here today to condemn our ministry. He came to challenge it to be more, to reach deeper. And I believe that challenge was divine." Near the back exit, Chuck stood quietly watching, having circled around after leaving the stage. He had no desire for the spotlight, only to witness whether his intervention would bear fruit. What he saw moved him deeply, a man of enormous influence, choosing humility over pride, authenticity over performance. Pastor Daniel Brooks slowly made his way to center stage, his aged frame moving with purpose despite physical limitation. When he reached Joel and Victoria, he embraced them both, tears flowing freely down his weathered face. "This," Daniel said, his voice breaking with emotion, "is the ministry I've been praying for all these years. Not bigger, not more famous, but truer." The unplanned tableau they created, Joel and Victoria, flanked by the elderly. Pastor Daniel spoke volumes about continuity and change, tradition and transformation. There was no triumphalism, no theatrical declaration of a new era. Just human beings acknowledging their limitations and reaching for something more authentic. In the media pit, Evelyn lowered her camera, realizing that some moments shouldn't be filtered through a lens. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a turning point, not just for Lakewood Church but potentially for the broader conversation about faith in modern America. "I want to close our time together differently than usual," Joel said, his voice steady but vulnerable. "Not with promises that everything will work out perfectly in your life, but with an invitation to bring your whole self to God, doubts, fears, failures, and all." He stepped away from the podium, away from the protective barrier of professional presentation, and stood at the edge of the stage. "Some of you came today expecting inspiration, and instead, you got interruption. Some came for comfort, and instead you got challenge. I believe that wasn't accident but providence." Throughout the sanctuary, a new kind of silence had settled. Not the hush of entertainment anticipation, but the quiet of genuine reflection. The massive screens that typically projected Joel's image now remained dark. The focus wasn't on amplification but on connection. "We won't be selling books or DVDs in the lobby today," Joel continued, the statement itself marking a profound shift. "Instead, we'll have prayer teams available not to offer easy answers, but to sit with you in your questions." Victoria stepped forward, her hand finding Joel's. "And Joel and I will be there too, not as celebrities but as fellow travelers, equally in need of grace." As the service drew to its unplanned conclusion, something remarkable began happening throughout the sanctuary. People turned to one another. Strangers connecting, sharing quiet words, exchanging contact information. What had begun as an audience was transforming into a community. Marcus watched as the man who had questioned Joel about his daughter's death was surrounded by others who had experienced similar loss, not to silence his pain with platitudes, but to acknowledge its validity, to bear witness. Near the main exit, Chuck Norris prepared to slip away unnoticed, his mission complete. But as he turned to leave, he found himself face to face with Pastor Daniel. "You knew this would happen," Daniel said quietly. Not as accusation, but as recognition. Chuck shook his head slightly. "I knew it needed to happen. Whether it would." He glanced back toward the stage, where Joel and Victoria were embracing tearful congregants. That required courage on his part. Daniel nodded, understanding the distinction. Sometimes the greatest act of faith is admitting we don't have all the answers. And sometimes, Chuck replied, The greatest sermon is the one that gets interrupted. The two men shared a moment of mutual respect. Then Chuck slipped out the side door into the Houston sunshine. His name wouldn't appear in the church bulletin. His face wouldn't be featured on the ministry website. But his impact would ripple forward in ways that even he couldn't fully anticipate. Back inside, Joel Osteen stood at the center of a transformed sanctuary, facing both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of his ministry. The path of authentic faith would be harder than the road of polished performance. It would require more vulnerability, more humility, more willingness to sit with unanswerable questions. But as he looked out at the faces before him, some tear-streaked, some confused, but all fully present in a way they hadn't been before, he knew that Chuck Norris had given him not a public humiliation, but a sacred gift. The chance to rediscover the heart of his calling, to lead not from a platform, but from broken wholeness. And in that moment, something shifted permanently in Joel's understanding of ministry. Success wasn't measured in broadcast reach, or book sales, or building size. It was measured in truth spoken, in pain acknowledged, in the courage to say both, "I believe," and "I don't know," with equal conviction. The show was over. The ministry had just begun. Monday morning arrived with the relentless intensity of the Texas Sunday. Joel Osteen sat in his office at Lakewood Church, staring at his computer screen where social media exploded with reactions to yesterday's unprecedented service. Number Chuck Interruption and number Lakewood Awakening were trending nationally. Clips of the exchange had been viewed millions of times overnight. The responses ranged from cynical mockery to profound gratitude, from accusations of stage theatrics to testimonials of life-changing impact. What had been an intensely personal moment of reckoning was now public property, dissected and debated by strangers who hadn't been present to feel the weight of authenticity that had filled the sanctuary. A gentle knock at the door broke his concentration. Victoria entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The routine was familiar, Monday morning reflection, planning the week ahead. But nothing else about this Monday followed the established pattern. "How are you?" she asked simply, setting his coffee beside him. Joel sighed, running a hand through his hair. Overwhelmed, uncertain, and strangely free. Victoria smiled, understanding immediately. "You don't have to maintain the image anymore." "That's exactly it." Joel nodded, relief evident in his expression. "For years, I felt this pressure to be perfect, to never show doubt or struggle. It was like living in a glass house where any crack might bring everything down." He gestured to the screen, where commentators were debating whether the new Joel Osteen was authentic or merely a publicity stunt. "They're asking if it was real," he said. "But I know it was the most real moment I've had on that stage in years." Victoria pulled up a chair beside him. "So what now?" Before Joel could answer, another knock came. Marcus Reyes stood in the doorway, his usual security uniform replaced by casual clothes. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I can come back." "No, come in," Joel insisted, noticing the change in attire. "What's on your mind?" Marcus entered somewhat hesitantly. His relationship with the Osteens had always been professional, respectful, but distant. Now he seemed to be navigating new territory. "I wanted to talk about yesterday," he began, "and to let you know that whatever direction the ministry takes from here, I'm all in, not just as security, but as someone who believes in what happened on that stage." Joel studied the former Marine with newfound attention. "I didn't realize you had been struggling with our message." Marcus shifted slightly, unused to such direct conversation with his employer. "With parts of it, yes. I've seen too much in combat to believe that faith guarantees protection from suffering. But yesterday, That was a faith I could recognize. The simple testimony hit Joel with unexpected force. Here was a man who had stood guard Sunday after Sunday, fulfilling his duty, while privately questioning the very message he was protecting. "Thank you for your honesty," Joel said. "And for not stopping Chuck when you could have." A hint of a smile crossed Marcus's typically stoic face. Some interruptions are divine. As Marcus excused himself, another visitor appeared at the door. Evelyn Carter, the journalist who had captured yesterday's events. Joel had given countless interviews over the years, but something told him this one would be different. "Miss Carter," he greeted her. "I suppose you're here to get the full story?" Evelyn nodded, but her usual journalistic detachment seemed tempered by something else. "Yes, but maybe not the story I came for originally." Joel gestured for her to sit. Victoria squeezed his shoulder supportively before leaving them to talk. "Before we begin," Evelyn said, setting up her recorder, "I should tell you that I'm not religious. I came to Lakewood to document what I assumed was just another carefully packaged faith experience. I didn't expect authenticity," Joel suggested. "Humanity," Evelyn corrected him. "I didn't expect to see someone of your stature risk everything for something as intangible as truth." For the next hour, they talked not the polished, message-focused interview that typically characterized Joel's media appearances, but a raw conversation about doubt, fear, the pressure of platform, and the unexpected freedom that comes with vulnerability. "Chuck Norris could have humiliated you," Evelyn observed. "Instead, he offered you liberation. Why do you think he chose that approach?" Joel considered the question carefully. "Because his goal wasn't to tear down, but to build up, not to destroy a ministry but to challenge it to greater depth. That's the difference between criticism and prophetic interruption." Evelyn made notes, then asked the question that media personalities across the country were debating: is this change permanent? Will next Sunday's service reflect this new direction, or will Lakewood return to the formula that built your audience? Joel looked out his office window toward the vast parking lot that surrounded the converted arena. For years, filling those spaces had been a metric of success. Now he found himself questioning that assumption. "I don't know exactly what form it will take," he admitted. "But I know there's no going back to performing faith. Whatever we lose in polish, we'll gain in power." After Evelyn left, Joel sat alone in his office, contemplating the weight of that commitment. The phone rang his publicist, undoubtedly calling about the flood of interview requests and media opportunities arising from yesterday's viral moment. He let it go to voicemail. Instead, he opened his father's Bible, the one he had inherited when John Osteen passed, and Joel reluctantly stepped into leadership. He had always cherished it as a symbol, but now he found himself hungry for its substance. As afternoon faded into evening, Joel remained in his office, not planning next Sunday's presentation but wrestling with ancient words, rediscovering their challenge alongside their comfort. The performance coach he had worked with for years would have been shocked to find him preparing not by practicing delivery, but by confronting his own questions. A soft tap at the door revealed Pastor Daniel, looking more energized than he had in years. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," the elderly minister said, noticing the open Bible. "Not at all," Joel replied, genuinely pleased to see him. "I could use your perspective." Daniel settled into a chair, his eyes bright with purpose. "I've been thinking about what happens next. The world is watching, Joel. They're waiting to see if yesterday was a moment or a movement." Joel nodded, feeling the weight of that reality. "I've been asking myself the same question. How do we build on what happened without turning it into just another program or formula?" Daniel leaned forward, his voice carrying decades of pastoral wisdom. "By remembering that transformation isn't a product we create, but a process we submit to. Chuck Norris didn't bring a new methodology. He brought a mirror. The metaphor struck Joel deeply. A mirror that showed us what we'd become and what we could be. Exactly, Daniel affirmed. And the question now isn't how to package that moment, but how to remain transparent enough that more moments like it can occur. As they talked, the beginnings of a vision emerged, not a strategic 5-year plan or a church growth strategy, but a commitment to creating space for authenticity, for questions alongside answers, for struggle alongside victory. It will cost us, Joel acknowledged. Some people come for the guarantee of happy endings, not the mess of honest journey. Daniel's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. The gospel has always been costly. We just tried to make it comfortable. Later that evening, Joel called a meeting of Lakewood's leadership team. They gathered in the conference room adjacent to the sanctuary department heads, ministry leaders, and key staff who collectively shaped the church's direction. The tension was palpable. Everyone had witnessed yesterday's events, but no one was certain what they signified for Lakewood's future. Joel had built one of the most successful ministries in American history by following a clear formula. Deviating from it represented uncharted territory. "I've asked you here," Joel began, standing before them with a new humility, "because yesterday changed everything for me personally, and I believe, for our ministry collectively." He paused, looking at each face around the table. Some showed excitement, others apprehension. For years, we've measured success by growth, attendance, reach, influence. We've crafted services that are uplifting, encouraging, and professionally executed. Joel took a deep breath. But I've realized that in focusing so much on inspiration, we may have sacrificed transformation. Rachel, the worship director, spoke up tentatively. "Are you saying the music, the production, it's all been wrong?" Joel shook his head. "Not wrong, but incomplete. Excellence isn't the problem. It's making excellence an end in itself. What if our polish has created a barrier to authenticity? What if our certainty has left no room for questions?" Marcus, invited to the meeting despite not being part of the official leadership, offered his perspective. "In the military, we had a saying, 'Comfort is the enemy of growth.' Yesterday was uncomfortable for everyone, but look what grew from it." Gradually, the conversation shifted from defense of the status quo to exploration of possibility. What would worship look like if it embraced lament alongside celebration? How might preaching change if it acknowledged mystery alongside certainty? What could community become if it made space for doubt alongside faith? By the time the meeting concluded, no formal decisions had been made. No programs launched. No initiatives announced. But something more fundamental had shifted: a willingness to risk the successful for the significant, to value depth over breadth. As the team dispersed, Pastor Daniel lingered behind with Joel. "You know," the elderly minister said, "I've been thinking about Chuck. He didn't stay for the aftermath. He didn't claim credit or seek attention." Joel nodded thoughtfully. "He came to deliver a message, not to build a platform." "There's a lesson in that too," Daniel observed. "Sometimes the greatest impact comes from those who don't need the spotlight." The week unfolded in a whirlwind of media coverage, internal discussions, and personal reflection. By Thursday, Joel had declined every major interview request, issued no formal statements, and focused instead on an intensive process of listening to his staff, to congregation members, to his own long-suppressed questions. Victoria found him late Thursday evening in the empty sanctuary, sitting alone in the front row, looking up at the massive stage. "Nervous about Sunday?" she asked, sliding into the seat beside him. Joel smiled ruefully, terrified. For 20 years, I've known exactly what a Lakewood service should look and feel like. Now, I'm stepping into the unknown. Victoria took his hand. Not alone. No, he agreed, not alone. They sat in comfortable silence, contemplating the space before them, a space that had hosted thousands of polished performances and one moment of raw authenticity. Do you think Chuck will come back? Victoria wondered. Joel shook his head. I don't think that was ever his intention. He came to awaken, not to lead. Like a modern-day prophet, Victoria mused. Enter. Deliver the message. Exit. As Sunday approached, the anticipation built not just within Lakewood's congregation, but across the country. Would the transformation be lasting or temporary? Had Joel Osteen truly changed? Or would market forces and institutional momentum pull him back to the formula that had built his success? What no one could see, what cameras couldn't capture, was the profound inner work taking place, a pastor rediscovering his calling, a congregation awakening to deeper hunger, a community beginning to value authenticity over performance. By the time Sunday morning dawned, the national media had arrived in force, parking satellite trucks outside Lakewood's sprawling campus. Social media buzzed with predictions and commentary. Some skeptics declared it all a publicity stunt. Others sensed the stirrings of genuine revival. But within the walls of the converted arena, something quieter and more profound was taking root, a return to the essence of faith, not as spectacle or self-help, but as the courageous journey of imperfect people pursuing a perfect God. The transformation had begun not with a dramatic declaration or a new program, but with a simple willingness to be interrupted by truth. And in that interruption, a door had opened to something authentic, enduring, and deeply human. As the first congregants began arriving, passing through security checks and finding their seats, there was a palpable sense of anticipation, not for entertainment, but for encounter. Not for performance, but for presence. The awakening had begun. The Texas dawn painted Houston's skyline in hues of amber and gold as a gentle winter breeze swept through the city streets. 6 months had passed since the Sunday that shook not only Lakewood Church, but sent ripples through the broader landscape of American Christianity. December had brought an unusual chill to the Gulf Coast region, forcing Houstonians to dust off rarely used winter coats and scarves. Inside Lakewood Church, physical warmth emanated from efficient heating systems, but a different kind of warmth permeated the atmosphere. The authentic connection of a community transformed through honest engagement with both faith and doubt. Evelyn Carter slipped into a back row seat, her documentary equipment packed away. Today, she came not as a journalist, but as a witness. Her notebook lay open on her lap, but the pages remained largely blank. What had begun as a routine assignment covering faith in modern America had evolved into a profound exploration of authenticity in religious spaces and had unexpectedly affected her own spiritual journey. Hard to believe it's been half a year, whispered a familiar voice. Evelyn turned to find Marcus Reyes settling into the seat beside her. The former security chief had undergone perhaps the most visible transformation since Chuck's intervention. He had exchanged his earpiece and tactical stance for the quieter role of church elder, his military discipline now channeled into building genuine community. "How's the documentary coming?" Marcus asked. "Final edits this week," Evelyn replied. "We premiere next month. I still can't believe how this story evolved." "Neither can we," Marcus admitted with a slight smile. "But that's what happens when you make space for the unexpected." The sanctuary before them looked similar at first glance. The same sweeping architecture, the same technical capabilities, but subtle shifts revealed the deeper transformation. The stage had been redesigned with a wooden lectern, replacing the sleek plexiglass podium. The theatrical lighting remained, but had been softened to create connection rather than spectacle. The massive video screens still dominated the space, but now they often displayed scripture passages or meditative imagery rather than close-ups of the speaker. Most telling was the congregation itself. The numbers had decreased somewhat. About 15,000 now filled a space designed for 20. Some had left when Joel's message shifted from guaranteed prosperity to authentic journey, but others had come drawn by the refreshing honesty, the permission to question, the space to struggle. The atmosphere had changed from concert-like excitement to attentive engagement. Congregants arrived earlier, stayed later, and connected more deeply during their time together. What had been an audience had become a community. At 10:30 sharp, Joel Osteen stepped onto the platform. His tailored suit remained, but his demeanor had evolved, less the polished presenter, more the authentic guide walking alongside his congregation through life's complexities. "Good morning, Lakewood," he began, his voice warm but carrying a depth that had been developing over months of transformation. "Today we continue our series on faith in the valley. We've been exploring what it means to trust God not just when life goes according to plan, but when it falls apart entirely." The congregation listened with focused attention. These were no longer passive consumers of religious entertainment, but active participants in spiritual formation. Last week we looked at Job's friends, well-meaning people who offered terrible comfort because they couldn't admit that sometimes there are no easy answers. Joel continued. Today we turn to Job's own response to suffering. Honest, raw, sometimes angry, but ultimately authentic. In the front row, Victoria sat beside Meredith, the woman whose heartbreaking question about her daughter's cancer had become a pivotal moment in Lakewood's transformation. What had begun as a moment of raw pain had evolved into a healing journey, with Meredith now leading Lakewood's grief support ministry. Pastor Daniel, looking more energized than he had in years despite his advanced age, sat nearby with a small notebook, jotting occasional thoughts. The elderly minister had experienced a revitalization that seemed directly proportional to the church's growing authenticity. Joel's sermon that morning carried none of the formulaic optimism that had once been his trademark. Instead, he spoke with nuanced depth about faith's complexity, how doubt isn't the opposite of belief, but often part of its deepening, how questioning God has biblical precedent, how comfort often comes, not through answers, but through presence. The prosperity gospel promises that faith shields you from valleys, Joel said, echoing words Chuck had spoken that fateful day. The true gospel promises that faith sustains you through them and that you never walk alone. As he spoke, Evelyn observed the congregation's response, not the emotional manipulation of a crowd being led to predetermined reactions, but the thoughtful engagement of individuals wrestling with profound truths. Some nodded in recognition of shared experience, others took notes. A few wiped away tears. When the service concluded, the typical rush for parking lots was notably absent. People lingered, forming small conversation clusters throughout the sanctuary. What had once been efficient crowd management had become intentional community building. Victoria spotted Evelyn and made her way to the back row. Genuine warmth in her greeting. "Gathering final impressions for your film?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. "It premieres next month. I wanted one more Sunday before finalizing the edit." "And what's your conclusion?" Victoria asked with gentle directness. "Was it real? Did it last?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "What I've witnessed isn't a rebranding or a strategic pivot. It's a genuine reclaiming of what church was always meant to be, a place where masks come off, where the whole truth is spoken, where both joy and sorrow have a home." Victoria's eyes brightened with emotion. "Joel would love to hear that. He's in his office if you'd like to say goodbye." Evelyn made her way through the winding corridors of Lakewood's administrative wing, passing meeting rooms now repurposed for community initiatives, a food pantry coordination center, a grief support group space, a vocational training program for formerly incarcerated individuals. The church's resource allocation had shifted dramatically from production value to practical service. She found Joel in his office, the space noticeably transformed. The sleek corporate decor had been replaced by something warmer, more personal. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled not with Joel's own bestsellers but with theological works spanning traditions and centuries. A worn prayer rug lay in one corner, evidence of hours spent in contemplation. "Evelyn." Joel greeted her warmly, rising from his desk. "Victoria mentioned you were here for a final observation. The documentary premieres next month," she explained, settling into a chair across from him. "I wanted one more Sunday to round out the narrative." Joel smiled with genuine interest. "And what's the story arc you've settled on? Scandal? Redemption? Transformation?" "Truth," Evelyn answered simply. "The power of a single moment of truth to change not just an individual, but an entire community." Joel nodded appreciatively. "That's more insightful than most of the media coverage we've received." "Speaking of coverage," Evelyn ventured, "the ratings reports show your television audience has decreased by almost 40%. A shadow of old anxiety flickered across Joel's face, quickly replaced by peaceful resolve. "Yes. Some viewers wanted the polished, problem-free version of faith we used to offer. When we started acknowledging life's complexities, that faith doesn't exempt you from suffering, that questions are part of the journey, some changed the channel." "Any regrets?" Evelyn asked. Joel considered the question carefully. "I regret the years I spent offering people an incomplete gospel, one that emphasized blessing without cost, victory without struggle, faith without doubt. I don't regret the path we're on now, even with smaller numbers and tighter budgets." Evelyn made a note, then asked the question that had lingered throughout her project. "There's just one missing piece in my documentary. One voice we haven't captured." Joel understood immediately. "Chuck." "Yes. He's declined every interview request. No one has heard from him since that Sunday." Joel smiled, unsurprised. "That's consistent with who he is. He never wanted the spotlight. He wanted the message to be heard. But for the documentary, his perspective would add significant depth." Evelyn pressed gently. "Do you have any way to contact him?" Joel hesitated, then opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small, sealed envelope. This came about a month after that Sunday. No return address, but the handwriting. I knew who it was from. He handed it to Evelyn, who looked at him questioningly. "It's personal," Joel acknowledged. "But I think he would be okay with you reading it. It captures his heart better than any interview could." Evelyn carefully opened the envelope and unfolded a single sheet of paper covered in neat, masculine handwriting. "Joel, I've been following the changes at Lakewood from afar. What began as interruption has become transformation, not just of structure or style, but of substance. That took courage. Most men with platforms as large as yours choose security over sincerity. You chose differently. Faith isn't measured by the size of the crowd you draw, but by the depth of the truth you speak. The hardest sermons to preach are often the ones most needed. I won't be returning to Lakewood. My purpose wasn't to become part of your story, but to remind you of the story you're already part of, one where authenticity matters more than approval, where truth sometimes comes through unexpected messengers, and where real strength is shown not in dominating others, but in surrendering to something greater than yourself. Keep speaking truth, even when it costs. Keep making space for questions alongside answers. And remember that the gospel's power isn't in promising perfect lives, but in transforming imperfect ones. With respect and prayer, Chuck Norris Evelyn finished reading, deeply moved by the simple eloquence of the letter. She handed it back to Joel with genuine gratitude. "Thank you for sharing this. It's perfect, better than any interview could be." Joel carefully returned the letter to his desk. "He changed us, you know. Not by force or humiliation, but by truth, offered with respect. I don't think I fully understood the difference until it happened." As Evelyn prepared to leave, she had one final question. "Do you ever wish you could thank him in person?" Joel considered this thoughtfully. "I used to. But I've realized that the best way to thank him isn't through words, but through actions. By leading with authenticity, by valuing truth over popularity, by remembering that real ministry happens not in the spotlight but in the shadows where people actually live." The documentary premiered in January, to critical acclaim. The interruption captured not just the dramatic moment when Chuck Norris walked down the aisle of America's largest megachurch, but the lasting transformation that followed, a church reclaiming its prophetic voice, a pastor finding freedom in vulnerability, a community discovering that faith could be both intellectually honest and spiritually powerful. The film's final sequence showed Joel walking alone through the empty sanctuary early one morning, touching seats where lives had been changed, pausing at the spot where Chuck had stood. His voiceover, taken from Evelyn's final interview, provided the conclusion. "Sometimes the greatest act of faith isn't standing firm in what you've always believed. It's being willing to be interrupted by truth, even when that truth challenges everything you've built." The camera pulled back slowly, revealing the vastness of the sanctuary not as a testament to one man's success but as a space where authentic community was taking root. "Chuck Norris didn't come to tear down," Joel's voice continued. "He came to build up not a bigger platform, but a deeper foundation. Not a shinier image, but a truer reflection of what faith was always meant to be." The screen faded to black, followed by a simple text epilogue. Chuck Norris declined to be interviewed for this film. When asked about his intervention at Lakewood Church, his only comment was, "Some messages don't need interpretation. They just need to be heard." The documentary sparked conversations in churches across America. Pastors who had built ministries on similar formulas found themselves questioned by congregants hungry for greater depth. Seminary students debated the balance between accessibility and authenticity, between comfort and challenge. Religious commentators analyzed the phenomenon from every angle, some dismissing it as a publicity stunt, others recognizing it as a potential watershed moment for American Christianity. But beyond the public discourse, beyond the think pieces and panel discussions, something more profound was happening in individual hearts. A quiet reckoning with the difference between performance faith and lived conviction. In a small rural church outside of Dallas, an elderly man sat in the back row, listening intently to a young pastor, struggling to find his voice. No one recognized him, just another congregant, seeking not entertainment but encounter, not performance but presence. Chuck Norris had never wanted fame or accolades for his actions at Lakewood. He had sought only to speak truth in a culture of careful image management, to challenge comfort with conviction, to remind a celebrity pastor that true strength comes not from audience approval, but from divine authenticity. As he listened to the earnest young minister, Chuck smiled slightly. The megachurch moment had captured headlines, but this, the quiet, faithful proclamation of truth in an ordinary setting, this was where real transformation happened, one heart at a time. The echo of his interruption continued to ripple outward, touching lives he would never meet, changing conversations he would never hear. awakening hunger for authenticity in spaces both grand and humble. And in that ongoing impact, Chuck found deeper satisfaction than any applause or recognition could provide. He had not sought to become the story. He had sought only to remind people of the story they were already part of, one where truth matters more than comfort, where authenticity outweighs performance, and where the most powerful messages often come through unexpected messengers. As the young pastor finished his sermon, Chuck slipped out quietly, unnoticed, and content to remain so. His mission had never been about personal recognition but about spiritual recalibration, a reminder that faith, in its purest form, isn't a polished performance but a raw, honest, transformative encounter with truth. And in sanctuaries, both grand and modest, that truth continued to echo, not in thunderous declarations, but in authentic moments of human connection with divine purpose. Not in spotlights and spectacle, but in the quiet courage to speak and hear truth, whatever the cost. Because real strength, as Chuck had demonstrated, isn't measured by applause, but by impact. Not by how many hear your name, but by how many hear the truth and are forever changed by it. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.